I was pouring my second cup of coffee when my phone buzzed on the counter, and my daughter's name lit up the screen with a subject line that made my hands go still. Wedding weekend, please read carefully before you respond. I opened it thinking she wanted help picking a hotel. Instead, the first line read, Dad, in order to keep things smooth for everyone, we've put together some guidelines for the weekend. 18 guidelines. I laughed out loud, actually laughed, standing there in my kitchen in my socks, because I thought it had to be a joke, some kind of bit she and her fiancé were pulling on me. Then I kept scrolling, and by guideline 11, the laugh had gone dry in my throat. My wife came in from the garden with dirt still on her gloves and asked what was so funny, and I said, Nothing, Ruthie. Come look at this. And I watched her face do the same thing mine had done, moving from confusion to disbelief to something quieter and harder to name. 41 years of raising that girl, and here was a list telling me how to stand, what to wear, when to speak, and when not to. Before I go further, I want to say I'm grateful you're spending part of your evening with me. Whoever you are, wherever you're watching from, drop your state or your country down in the comments if you don't mind. I read every one, and it means more than you'd think to see how far a story like this travels. And I should say plainly, this account is fiction, built for reflection, not reporting on any real family. Any resemblance to people you know is coincidence, but I promise you the feelings inside it are true. My name is Walter Combs. Most people who've known me more than 5 minutes call me Walt. I'm 66 years old, and for 39 of those years I was a machinist, the kind who could listen to an engine and tell you what was wrong with it before you popped the hood, the kind who kept a shop running on Route 9 outside Danbury, Connecticut, until my knees gave out the argument my hands never did. I sold the shop 3 years ago to a younger fellow named Perez who calls me sometimes just to ask what I'd do about a stubborn transmission, and I always tell him, and it always makes my week a little brighter. Ruth and I have been married 43 years. We live in the same house we bought in 1986, a little cape with green shutters on Larkspur Lane, and I've replaced that roof twice myself, once at 40 and once at 61, which in hindsight might have been a mistake I'll get to later. We have one daughter, Kayla, 31 years old now, engaged to a man named Preston Aldrich, a name that always sounded to me like something off a yacht club roster, though I never said that out loud to anyone but Ruth. Kayla works in marketing for a software company in Hartford. Preston does something with private equity that I have never fully understood despite 4 separate explanations, 3 of them at Thanksgiving dinner while I was trying to carve a turkey. It was an ordinary Tuesday when the email came. Ordinary in every way except that Ruth had made her chicken and dumplings, the recipe her own mother taught her, and the whole kitchen smelled like that particular kind of comfort that makes a house feel like it's holding you instead of just containing you. The radio on the windowsill was playing something out of Nashville, low, the way Ruth likes it when she cooks. I was at the table doing the crossword, half paying attention, when my phone buzzed. Kayla sent us something, Ruth said, drying her hands on the dish towel that hangs off the oven door. Same spot it's hung for 20 years. She said it's important. Make sure you both read it together. I opened it right there at the table. The subject line alone should have told me something. Kayla was never a formal writer. Not since she was a teenager firing off 2-word texts that used to drive her mother up the wall. This read like something drafted by a committee. The email opened warm enough. She said she and Preston wanted the wedding weekend to be relaxed, elegant, low drama for everyone involved, and that to make that happen, they'd put together some guidelines for the immediate family. She called them guidelines. I want you to sit with that word the way I did, because I turned it over in my head for a long moment before I understood what it was doing there. Guidelines is a soft word. Guidelines is the word you use when you don't want to say rules, and rules is the word you use when you don't want to say demands. And by the time I finished reading all 18 of them, demands felt like it was still being generous. Guideline 1. Family members are asked to refrain from discussing the old days or how things used to be during the reception, as it can come across as out of touch with the couple's vision for their future. Guideline 2. No gifts that weren't purchased from the registry, as handmade or sentimental items can create uneven emotional dynamics among guests. I read that one twice. I have made things with my hands my entire life. I built the bookshelf in Kayla's childhood bedroom, the one that's still there, the one she used to climb like a ladder until she was 7, and Ruth made me bolt it to the wall. Guideline 7. Seating will be assigned strictly by the planning team. No requests, no exceptions. To maintain the aesthetic flow of the room. Guideline 11, the one that stopped my laugh cold, read, parents of the bride and groom are asked to keep toasts under 90 seconds and to avoid emotional appeals, as the couple wants the tone of the evening to stay light and forward-looking. Forward-looking. I read that phrase maybe 6 times, sitting there at my own kitchen table with my dumplings going cold, and I thought about every hour I'd spent forward-looking on Kayla's behalf, every extra shift, every roof, every single thing I had done with my eyes fixed entirely on her future, and never once on my own. And here was a list telling me not to look backward for 90 seconds at her wedding. Ruth read it over my shoulder, her hand coming to rest on the back of my neck the way it does when she's steadying herself as much as me. Walt, she said, very quiet. Why would our own daughter treat us like we're strangers at a dinner party? I didn't have an answer for her. I still don't. Not really. Not one that makes it make sense. I should tell you a little about what those 39 years actually cost, because it matters for what comes later. When Kayla was 19, she got into a design program out in Providence. Tuition steep enough to make my stomach drop the first time I saw the number written down. I told her we'd figure it out, the way you tell your kid these things before you've actually figured out anything. What I didn't tell her, what I never told her, was that I picked up weekend work at a garage 2 towns over for the better part of 3 years, 6 a.m. Saturdays and Sundays on top of my regular week, coming home smelling like brake fluid and exhaustion, telling Ruth it was just some extra hours, nothing to worry about. I never told Kayla either. It wasn't a secret I was keeping to be noble about it. I just didn't see the point of a kid carrying the weight of what her education cost. A man in his 50s, standing under fluorescent lights on a Sunday morning when she should have been thinking about her portfolio, not her father's back. Then, there was the roof. Kayla and Preston bought their first house 2 years ago, a nice enough place out in Cheshire. And that first winter, a contractor quoted them $11,000 to redo the roof before it caved something in. Preston balked at the number, said they'd revisit it in the spring, which anyone with eyes could tell meant they didn't have it and didn't want to say so. I drove out there on a Saturday in October, climbed up with my nail gun and my bundles of shingles, 64 years old, and did the whole thing myself over 2 weekends. On the second Saturday, my foot slipped on a patch I hadn't swept clear, and I went down the slope faster than I want to describe, catching myself on the gutter hard enough to tear something in my shoulder that still aches when the weather turns, and hard enough that my left hip has never sat quite right in its socket since. Ruth heard the gutter groan from the driveway where she was holding the ladder steady, and the sound she made when she saw me hanging there is not one I'm going to try to put into words, because some sounds belong only to the people who made them and heard them. Kayla came by that evening, hugged me careful around the shoulder, said she was glad I was okay, stayed maybe 20 minutes because she and Preston had a dinner reservation. I told her I was fine. That's what I do. I have always told her I was fine. I didn't say any of that to her when I read the 18 guidelines. What I did instead was close the laptop, finish my coffee, which had gone cold, and go sit in the garage for a while with the door up, looking at nothing in particular. Ruth found me out there an hour later, sat down on the stool across from my workbench, and didn't say anything for a long time either. Finally, she said, "We're still going, aren't we?" It wasn't really a question. "We're still going," I said. "I'm not going to be the reason our daughter doesn't have her father at her wedding, but I'm not going empty-handed either." It was 2 days after that, going through the hall closet looking for a suit bag, that I found the shoebox. Ruth keeps things I don't always know about. That's not a criticism. 43 years of marriage means you both keep private rooms inside yourselves, and I've never begrudged her that. This particular box was pushed to the very back of the top shelf, behind the Christmas ornaments we don't use anymore, and it had my name on it in her handwriting, faded some, like it had been written a long time ago. Inside was a ledger, a plain green composition notebook, the kind Kayla used to use for algebra homework. I opened it, not thinking much of it, and the first entry, dated in a year, I had to do math to place, read, "Set aside $23 from grocery money. Told Walt we needed a new mixer. We didn't." I sat down right there on the closet floor with that notebook in my lap and read the whole thing front to back. and it took me the better part of an hour because my eyes kept needing to stop. 22 years of entries. Small amounts mostly. $5 here, 30 there. Money Ruth had quietly skimmed off the household budget, off her part-time hours at the library, off birthday cash from her sister, and funneled into a savings account under Kayla's name that I never knew existed. She'd told me for 2 decades that account was for emergencies, and I'd never once asked to see the statements, because I trusted her the way you trust the person you've built a whole life alongside. What I hadn't known was that the emergencies she'd been saving for were the ones I was already covering with my Sunday shifts, and that somewhere along the way, without either of us saying it out loud to the other, we had both been quietly bleeding ourselves dry for the same girl, each of us keeping the other from knowing the full size of it, each of us thinking we were protecting the other from worry. The last entry in the notebook, dated just 8 months back, read, "Kayla mentioned Preston's family as old money. I want her to feel like she came from something too. Added $40. I sat on that closet floor, and I am not ashamed to tell you, I cried. The real kind. The kind a man my age doesn't do often, and doesn't do easily. Not because I was angry at Ruth. Because I finally understood the whole shape of something I'd only ever seen half of, and because I thought about that phrase, old money, and about a woman who had never once complained, who hummed while she washed dishes, who had spent 22 years quietly trying to buy our daughter a kind of dignity she was afraid we hadn't given her by birth. I put the notebook back exactly where I found it and didn't say anything to Ruth that night. I needed a few days to figure out what I was going to do with what I now knew, and I am, by nature, a man who thinks with his hands before he thinks with his mouth. What I decided to build was a chest, not large, about the size of a bread box, cedar-lined, with a lid I fitted with brass hinges I'd had in a coffee can since before Kayla was born. Guideline 2 said no handmade gifts. I want to be honest with you. Some part of me built that chest specifically because of Guideline 2, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. I spent 4 evenings on it in the garage, careful work, dovetailed joints at the corners because a nailed box comes apart eventually, and a dovetailed one doesn't. Not for 100 years if you do it right. I sanded it through 5 grits, until the wood felt like something you'd want to hold your face against. I carved Kayla and Preston, June 8th, into the underside of the lid, where you'd only see it if you were looking. Small, private, the way I do most of my important work. Before I tell you what went inside that chest, and what I asked our neighbor Dell to do with it that night at the reception, would you do me a favor and just type "chest" down in the comments, so I know you're still here with me? It means the world, truly. And a quick note, what follows has some details reimagined for the sake of the story, so if that's not the kind of thing you're looking for tonight, no hard feelings at all, I understand completely. Ruth found me lining the inside with a scrap of blue velvet from an old jewelry case she said she had no more use for. She stood in the garage doorway with her arms crossed against the evening chill, watching me work, and finally asked what I was putting in it. "Your notebook," I said. She went very still. "You found it!" "I found it," I said, 8 days ago. I've been carrying it around in my head ever since, trying to figure out what to do with what's in it." Her hand came up to her mouth. "Walt, if that goes in that chest, if she reads it, at her wedding, in front of, I know," I said. "I know exactly where and when. That's rather the point." She was quiet a long moment, looking not at me, but at the chest itself, at the grain of the wood, catching the shop light. "Okay," she said finally, "just that. Okay." I placed the green notebook on the right side of the chest, and on the left, a small stack of photographs I'd pulled together. Kayla at 6 on my shoulders at the county fair. Kayla at 16 the week I taught her to drive stick in the church parking lot. Kayla at 19 the day I drove her to Providence with everything she owned packed into my truck bed, both of us pretending neither of us was crying at the drop-off. On top of the photographs, I laid a folded piece of notepaper with 7 lines written in my own plain hand. "Kayla, I'm not coming to your wedding to make a scene. I'm coming because I've been your father for 31 years, and that isn't something I stopped being because of a list. Inside this chest is something your mother made for you, quietly, over 22 years. She never showed it to me. I found it by accident. I think it's time you knew what it says, and what it cost." The wedding was held at a place called Fenwick Hall, out past Litchfield. A converted barn with exposed beams and string lights, The kind of venue that costs more per hour than I used to make in a month back when I started at the shop. When the seating chart went up in the lobby, I found our names quickly enough, table 19, tucked against the service hallway, where the waitstaff kept swinging through with trays, about as far from the head table as the room's geometry would allow. Ruth found it a half-second after I did, and I felt her hand find my elbow, steadying either herself or me. I honestly couldn't say which. Our neighbors, Dell and Marion Whitfield, were seated with us, and when Dell saw the placement, his jaw set in a way I'd only seen a handful of times in the 26 years we'd lived next to each other on Larkspur Lane. "Well," he said quietly, "that's a choice." I set the cedar chest down on the gift table myself, right in the middle where it couldn't be missed, and went and sat down at table 19, and I did not say a word about it to anyone. The toasts came after dinner. Preston's father, a silver-haired man named Gordon Aldrich, who ran some kind of investment firm out of Greenwich, gave a smooth, funny toast that ran a good deal longer than 90 seconds. Nobody minded, nobody counted. Then it was my turn, and Kayla's eyes found mine across the room with something like a warning in them. "Remember, guideline 11, they seemed to say. Keep it light." I stood, and I kept it under 90 seconds, and I kept it light, and I sat back down, and if my voice caught once near the end, I don't think anyone but Ruth noticed. It was Marion Whitfield who reached the gift table first. During the dancing, drawn the way people are drawn to a beautifully made object sitting among the gift bags and cards. I watched her lift the cedar lid, watched her go still, watched her wave Gordon Aldrich over, of all people, because he happened to be standing nearest. He picked up the notebook, opened it, and I watched his face do the same slow recalculation I imagined mine had done on that closet floor 8 days earlier. He read the note. Then he looked up, found me across the room at table 19, and something shifted in his expression I hadn't expected from a man I'd exchanged maybe 40 words with all evening. "Excuse me?" Dell Whitfield said, standing up from our table without being asked. And it turns out a man who spent 30 years running heavy equipment for the county roads department has a voice that doesn't need a microphone. "I want to say something, if nobody minds." Nobody minded. "My name's Dell Whitfield. I've lived next door to Walt and Ruth Combs for 26 years. He talked about the weekend shifts at the garage, which he'd never once heard me admit to anyone but which he'd noticed all the same, the way a good neighbor notices things. He talked about the roof, about the sound Ruth made in that driveway, about the shoulder that still hangs a little wrong when I reach overhead. "That man is sitting at table 19 tonight," Dell said, "back by the kitchen doors. On a shoulder he tore open building this couple a roof they couldn't afford to pay for, and I watched some of you glance at that seating chart earlier and smirk. The room turned, the way a room turns when something true lands in it, heads swiveling toward Gordon Aldrich, who was still holding that green notebook like it had gotten heavier in his hands. Marion stood next, quieter than her husband but no less certain. She talked about the casserole Ruth had brought over the week Kayla had the flu as a teenager, about how she'd seen, just this past spring, through her kitchen window, Preston pour an entire pot of Ruth's soup down the disposal, rather than serve it at a dinner party because it wasn't really the aesthetic he and Kayla were going for that evening. Preston's face went the color of the tablecloths. Kayla looked at him. "Is that true?" she said. And it wasn't really a question either. It was the same tone her mother uses, the tone of a person who already knows the answer and needs to hear it said out loud anyway. Gordon Aldrich set the notebook down and looked at his son. "Preston," he said, "did you know about any of this? The roof, the extra shifts, 22 years of a woman skimming grocery money so your bride wouldn't feel like she married up." Preston's throat worked. "I didn't, Dad. I didn't know the specifics." "Would knowing the specifics have changed Guideline 11?" Gordon asked. "And I want you to know I did not put him up to that question. I didn't know the man well enough to put words in his mouth, but I have thought about that question many times since. Because it is, I think, the only question in the whole evening that actually mattered." Kayla walked toward the gift table then, the way a person walks when they've decided the only way through something is straight through the middle of it. She picked up the notebook herself, read the last entry, the one about old money, out loud, her voice cracking somewhere in the middle of it. Then she looked up, not at Preston, not at Gordon, but across the room to table 19, to me, to her mother sitting beside me with both hands pressed flat against the tablecloth, like she was steadying the whole earth. I want to tell you it ended in some big scene, some dramatic reckoning with shouting and tears, and a satisfying collapse of everyone who'd wronged us. It didn't. And if I'm honest, I'm glad it didn't, because that's not really what I wanted. Not down in the part of me that had spent 39 years building things meant to last. What happened instead was quieter. Kayla walked across that barn, in her wedding dress, in front of 120 guests, and she came and knelt down beside my chair at table 19, the way she used to kneel beside my workbench as a little girl asking what I was building, and she said, "Dad, I am so sorry." And that was all. And it was enough, because I could see in her face that she meant the whole shape of it, not just the seating chart, not just guideline 11, but 31 years of a girl who'd needed her father to look forward on her behalf and had never once thought to ask what that cost him to do. Ruth and I didn't stay much longer after that. We didn't need to. I stood, offered Ruth my arm, and we walked out of that barn into the cool June night, past the string lights, past the valet stand, and Dell's hand landed on my good shoulder at the door. One firm press, the kind of contact that doesn't need explaining between men who've shoveled each other's driveways for a quarter century. Marion hugged Ruth for a long moment and didn't say anything at all, which was exactly right. We got home to Larkspur Lane a little before midnight. The porch light was on, the way it always is, timer set, faithful. Ruth stood in the driveway a moment looking up at our own little house with the green shutters, and she said, "Walt, I'm glad we went." I said, "Me too." And I meant it more than I'd expected to when we'd first read that email 2 months before. In the weeks after, things settled the way things settle, not all at once, and not without some cost still owed. Gordon Aldrich called me himself, which I hadn't expected, said he'd laughed a little when he first saw where we'd been seated, and that he was sorry for it, and that he'd read that green notebook twice since the wedding, and hadn't looked at money the same way since. I told him I appreciated the call. Kayla and I talked longer than we had in years, a real conversation, the kind conducted between the actual people involved, instead of the versions of ourselves we'd been performing at each other across a dozen strained Thanksgivings. She said she hadn't known about the roof, not really known, not the way you know a thing when you've heard it said out loud in a room full of people who love you. She said she should have asked. I told her she should have. We didn't fix everything on that one phone call, but it was a start. And starts are worth something. Preston, to his credit, showed up on our porch about 3 weeks later with a case of the good beer and an offer to help me reframe the garage door, which had been sagging on its hinges for longer than I want to admit. We didn't talk much while we worked. We didn't need to. Some things get repaired better with your hands busy than with your mouth running. By late summer, the tomatoes Ruth had put in back in May were finally coming in heavy, the way they do in that stretch of August, when the whole yard smells like green and sun. One evening I went out to the garage after supper, and I had a piece of walnut on the bench I'd been saving since spring. Wide-grained, dark, the kind of board you don't cut into until you know exactly what it wants to become. Ruth appeared in the doorway with her tea, same as she does most evenings, and asked what I was making. "A jewelry box," I said, "for Marion. Her birthday's next month. And Dell mentioned she's been eyeing one in a catalog for months and won't let herself buy it." Ruth smiled, came and stood beside me, looked at the walnut the way she's looked at every piece of wood I've ever laid across that bench for 43 years, with the quiet appreciation of a woman who has watched a man love his work for longer than most marriages last. "That's beautiful grain," she said. "Black walnut," I told her. "Takes its time to find. Boards like this. Worth the wait, though." I picked up my marking gauge, set it against the edge, and drew the first line. And the garage filled up with that smell I've loved my whole working life. Sawdust and oil and the particular kind of quiet that comes from two people who don't need to fill every silence between them. My name is Walter Combs. I'm 66 years old. I spent 39 years building things that outlast the people who ordered them. And I'm still building. Slower now, but still building. I've got a wife who kept a green notebook for 22 years without telling me a word of it, and neighbors who'll stand up in a room full of strangers on your behalf without being asked twice, and a daughter who is learning, a little later than I'd have liked, but not too late, what it costs the people who love you quietly to keep loving you when you've stopped noticing. People sometimes ask me what I'd have done differently, and I'll tell you honestly, I'd have spoken up sooner. I let 39 years of quiet stand in for patience, when really it was just fear. Fear of being the difficult one. Fear of asking my daughter to see a cost I'd worked hard my whole life to make sure she never had to see. Don't make that mistake if you're sitting on something similar tonight. The people who love you without saying so, the ones writing things down in notebooks in the back of hall closets, they deserve to be seen by you before a room full of strangers ever has to see it for you. I'm not a man who talks much about faith, never have been. But I'll say this much. I believe there's a reason Dell and Marion Whitfield ended up on the other side of my fence 26 years ago. Same as I believe there's a reason some things find you exactly when you need finding. This wasn't a story that ended in anybody getting what they deserved in the way revenge stories usually promise that. It ended with a piece of black walnut on a workbench, and tomatoes coming in heavy in the side yard, and my wife standing beside me saying she was glad we went. That, as far as I've ever been able to figure, is the only kind of getting even worth having, the kind that hands you your own life back instead of taking someone else's away. If any part of this found you tonight, I hope it found you for a reason. Tell me down in the comments where you're watching from, and if something in here sat with you the way I hope it did, pass it along to somebody who might need it, and stick around for what comes next. Thank you for staying with me clear through to the end. It means more than I know how to say.